Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Howard Gluss. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm here in Los Angeles, California, in Beverly Hills, and I'm going to be talking about weight loss and how our environment, culture, and our family affects our weight loss. And I wanted to tell everyone I'm with the Kalili Center. We're a bariatric and full-service surgical center in Beverly Hills. We focus on bariatric surgery and educating the public about the good choices to make in food and weight loss. I'm very excited about this webinar because it's dealing with some external issues that influence our choices in food. A lot of times as a psychologist, we talk about internal issues, but now we're going to talk about how both our internal issues and our external issues affect us. So when we think about this dynamic, I want us to think about how various dynamics issues come into play. So it's both external, like our family, culture, our environment; internal, how we read that, our sense of self, how that affects our internal clocks, everything that goes to how it affects our personality. So all these difficult dynamics come to play, and they affect us in how we make choices with food. So it's never a simple thing. I wish I could tell people there's always a simple answer to things, but there really isn't. And on top of that, you have to think about the concept of nurture. Who are you? What's your personality like? What's your genetic predisposition to possibly gain weight or lose weight? What's your family history? Everything comes into play. So when we think about the environment, one of the things that affects people the most is issues like the restaurants that we go to, especially here in Los Angeles. A lot of people are working a lot, they're on the road a lot, so restaurant choices can affect them a great deal. And in America, we tend to go for very large portions. It seems like the more anxious we get, and I almost want to say the more insecure that we get, it seems like the portions in restaurants are getting larger and larger. This a lot of times accounts for a high rate of obesity. What's fascinating to me is that, recently I was in a restaurant and they had a light menu, and everything in the menu was supposed to be 600 calories. This restaurant tends to have very large portions, and that's what they're known for. When I ordered off of the 600 calorie menu, the food came, and I was surprised by the size, but what my first intuitive reaction was, I looked down and thought, oh, this is what 600 calories look like. I had a sense of it, and I'll tell you, my anxiety started to come up because I started to think, oh my God, all this time have I just been eating these like enormous portions, and I didn't really realize it. I thought I was eating healthy, but my food quantity was causing me to possibly gain weight. So what I suggested to a patient of mine is to get a container that maybe would fit that size of food, and then whenever he placed food, to put it inside that container, and then he would get a sense of what the reality was and what a portion size, an adequate portion size, could look like to him. And so what happens to people a lot of times is they experience, sometimes when they're in a group of people, a little bit of shame or anxiety when they want to order something off, quote, the special menu, because people may start giving them a hard time, or they may wonder if they're dieting, etc. And I'll get back to that concept of dieting. What I want you to think about is words are very powerful and very powerful psychologically. So it's more about making healthy choices. To say the word diet sounds restrictive, and we don't want to feel like we're restrictive because we're into things for the long term. And when you're into things for the long term, you have to find words and ways of conceptualizing in your brain that will make sense. So shame, that somehow we're different or people are going to give us a hard time. Remember, no one can make you feel guilty or shameful about something unless you actually allow them to. So what you could think about when you order in a special way is to try to think about how, I have a question here, I'm going to stop for a second. And oh, I missed the question, but it had to do, if you could repeat that question and send it back up, I'd love to. But it was about portion size and the size of containers. But unfortunately, I didn't see the whole question, so hopefully it will get back to us. So don't think of it as shame, but think of it as doing something special for yourself in order to nurture your well-being. In a lot of athletic sports, they tend to call food fuel. I love that concept because what it says is I'm putting something healthy inside my body that's going to give me energy and it's going to fuel me. If I'm doing an athletic competition, I want to put the right fuel in. Or they use the word clean. I want to put clean, good food into my system. Remember, in some respects, your system is like a car, and how you feed it is going to have a lot to do with the kind of food that you put inside. People oftentimes think of food in their environment as comfort food, a great concept. But what I don't understand a lot of times is why is comfort food food that is sometimes the worst food for us? Food that's high in fat, salt, sugar, etc. When I contemplated it and thought about it, someone just said containers are a great idea for controlling portions. I would agree, because even if you take something like pasta, for instance, and you put it in a container, you can only put so much pasta into it. And if you tend to use, let's say, a healthy sauce, then you can put that healthy sauce into it, and it will give you a sense of what control is actually like. And what we want to stay away from psychologically when we're dieting and dealing with our environment is the sense of deprivation. When people start to feel like they're being deprived, they'll start to rebel, and then they'll want to feel like they want to cheat. So you'll have to feel satiated in the choices that you make. So getting back to the concept of comfort food, that it's a bit of an interesting, complex idea, because it's food that's actually not causing us to be comfortable. What it is food that a lot of times is dealing with anxiety. Anxiety is so related to the food choices that we make. If we're experiencing a lot of anxiety, we may want foods that are very rich and high in calories, high in fat, high in carbs, to want to organize ourselves and keep us more grounded in some respects. Because when you eat foods that are less in carbohydrates, a lot of times it might give you more of a flighty or airy feeling. So monitor your anxiety as a way of making food choices. If you're in a very anxious state at the time, maybe you need to think about, I want to reduce some of my anxiety. So mindful, take a moment, take a break. Our environment is very powerful influence on us, and a lot of times it will create an influence in our food choices. I had a very interesting thing happen to me recently. I was traveling, and I've been trying to be very careful about my food choices, and it was a very stressful flight. I was in Chicago trying to change planes, and I walked by this bakery place, and they were baking bread, and the smell was just intoxicating. And bread is something I'm trying to stay away from, and all I thought was, I went through this whole litany of, I'm just going to give myself a break. I'm so anxious. I deserve it. I should allow myself to have this food. But what I realized was the smell of the bread was so powerful to me that it was causing this chain of reactions in my head. And I didn't want to eat the bread. I wanted to stay pure on my diet because I was trying to get my body used to burning calories in a certain way. The most powerful choice I made was I just left the environment. I left the site and went to a whole nother place in the airport. My first reaction to that was that feeling immediately went away, and I was grounded again in my sense of self. So don't minimize how powerful the environment can be on you and the food choices that we make, that even in our best situation, a lot of times we're going to make food choices that we may not necessarily want to make. We just had the Super Bowl here in the United States, and one of the things that we tend to do is it's a big time to drink beer and have a bunch of wings. And someone just mentioned that Girl Scouts cookies are their weak link, and I could completely understand that. And what she tends to do is she tends to take the Girl Scout cookies and she puts them in a Ziploc bag. I think that's a great idea because you're controlling your portion and you're being less impulsive in your choice. You actually have to go and open up that bag. What I would say is actually take the cookies, put them in the Ziploc bag, and maybe place them in the back of your refrigerator and put a bunch of healthy stuff in front of it. Because what you want to do is get away from impulsive choices and the environment that's going to cause you to do that. So if the food is in the back of the fridge, you've got all these healthy vegetables and fruits in front. When you have that urge, remember it's impulsive, you may not go for it right away, and you have to actually get through the fruits and vegetables to get to the cookies. So hopefully it'll be a sense of good guilt. You'll feel guilty and that may stop you. So that's a great way to limit the portions and gain some control. So getting back to my story about wings, is a patient of mine was telling me it's so hard for him to control himself because that's one of the foods he really likes. And as a male, he felt this obligation that he had to drink a lot of beer and eat a lot of wings. And he just recently had bariatric surgery here at the Kalili Center, and he's trying to not eat badly. But what his concern was, would his buddies look down on him? Would he be thought of as being less than for making choices like what he had done, is just brought some healthy veggies to be able to eat? And we talked about it, and the reality was his buddies were going to make fun of him and give him a difficult time. But he felt as though his choices to make a positive choice in his life and take care of himself were more important than actually succumbing to the pressures of what he called his family, which were buddies that he grew up with, that he had to spend some time and re-educate them and teach them who he was, who this new person was going to be. And once he got through that anxiety and realized this was a process with people around him, and they had to start feeling careful with who he was able to stand up more for himself and took the role of being the educator and not necessarily the person who was making people feel uncomfortable, but the person that was educating people about who he was and who he wanted to be, this new sense of self. And he said to me, you know, it's so hard because a lot of times he's eating in cars, he works as a salesman on the road, convenience foods are usually rich with sugar and salt. So we talked about it, and what we decided to do was he was going to prepare a lot of foods for him on Sunday for the week. And that was going to be his peaceful time, almost a meditative time. And during that period when he was doing it and preparing food portions, he would say to himself, I'm doing something positive and good for myself, that I won't give in to the pressure, that I know that if I have these foods ready, I'm going to be able to make these positive choices for myself. That's so important because in that period, this gentleman was taking care of himself. He was finding control over his environment instead of allowing his environment to control him. And it gave him a really good sense of self. It gave him a good sense of empowerment, and it gave him a sense that he was a stronger person than maybe some of his weak food choices. And it just kept building on itself, these type of choices. Environment again, and weather can be a very powerful effect on us. I grew up in Canada, and I remember growing up and always thinking, okay, the winter's coming, no one's going to see my body, so I can put on that winter weight, and I'd rationalize it. You know, a little few extra pounds won't be such a big deal because, you know, I need that warmth. I need that fat, like I was some sort of animal hibernating. I would laugh now when I look back on it, because I would think, okay, that's a complete rationalization. Yes, winter can have an effect on us. I'm just going to stop, go back and forth. Someone sent a question. Unfortunately, I missed it. So if you want to resend it, that would be great, and I'll try to take a look at it. So we come up with all these rationalizations and excuses of why we do things. Winter is a time to put on weight. Is a time no one's going to look at our body. We're with layers of food. Relationship. I talked to a gentleman today in an intake I did here at the Kalili Center, and his feeling was he had gone through a breakup with his girlfriend. That was an excuse for him to put on 30 pounds. But again, it was just really an excuse when it comes down to it, because he could have made different choices. For instance, he could have gone to talk to a therapist and talked out some of his feelings instead of acting out on his feelings. So be sensitive to using weather in our environment as an excuse for gaining weight. But there is a correlation between sunny weather a lot of times and its effect on our mood. For instance, most people tend to get depressed during winter when there's not much sun out. So when you are going through, and remember, depression a lot of times can lead to weight gain. That's one of the ways people tend to deal with weight gain. So if you're in that situation, the first thing is just be mindful that you're in that situation and that you need to even try harder to make positive choices. When I was thinking about the environment and our culture, et cetera, and everything that comes to play, I was thinking about it at my home, and then this commercial came on television, and it was a commercial about chocolate. And what it was this beautiful, gorgeous woman eating chocolate and almost bathing herself in chocolate. And I thought to myself, that's such a powerful message psychologically, that certain foods are considered sexy. Let's be honest. No one's going to eat steamed broccoli and feel sexy. They're going to go to chocolate. They're going to go to candy and those type of foods to try to lose weight. So even though we know that psychologically, what we have to do is we have to realize these messages in the media are so powerful to us that we have to dissociate ourselves from them and recognize that, yes, a little bit of chocolate is okay, but chocolate doesn't necessarily make us beautiful and sexy. That's the message the advertisers want us to get. And the truth is, the woman who's probably the model in that commercial probably never eats the chocolate, but is eating the steamed broccoli. So these messages about what's sexy and what might make us smart and what the media tells us about food, causes a lot of obesity. Go back to my original concept of take a container and see what 600 calories look like. And then when you go into a restaurant that wants to supersize things, realize there's a huge difference between the two. But psychologically, you have to put yourself in a place where you realize that's not about deprivation, that other food will actually cause, if you use it long-term, states of depression, anxiety, mood shifts, eventually can affect your health a great deal, can affect your sleep patterns. So supersizing is not necessarily a good thing. Culture. Remember, we're dealing with a complex dynamic here. Culture is not separate from environment. Culture is not separate from media influence. The culture that we live in a lot of times will affect the type of media messages we're getting. A lot of times culture and family is dealt with in food portions. I know I grew up in sort of a traditional Jewish family, and during Passover, that was a big time for us to eat. And I always used to think, I think it's a game that the idea is you need to eat enough food so you can get so full by the end of the meal, you basically can't walk anymore and you have to fall asleep. And somehow we'd all collapse and go into different beds and different bedrooms. And somehow if we did that, then we were showing love and appreciation, especially to my mother or my aunts that would cook the food, that the only way you could show it was you just had to eat these huge amounts of food. To me, food and love in my culture was such a powerful message, especially a lot of times foods that were rich in carbohydrates. And when I was a teenager and I was overweight, I started to try and watch my food and watch my food intake. There was a big conflict between my mom and myself, because she took it in a very personal way, that somehow my food choices that were not necessarily the food she was cooking were personal affront to her. It was very personalized. People could feel this in a marriage, they can feel it with friendships, etc. But I had to go through this learning curve with her and explain to her what I was trying to do. This was so important too. Don't give up on your first try. It takes a long time for people to get who you are and what you're trying to do. And it eventually had a very powerful effect on our family. I noticed that she started to cook healthier foods and make more salads and cook fish more often, and fish that was grilled. That took about a year or two. So remember, psychologically, the process of change is not an easy process. It takes a long time. Just assume that it's going to take longer than you think it's going to take. And then if you're pleasantly surprised, that's great. I may have mentioned this in a previous webinar, but it's worth repeating. I've been working with a gentleman who's going for bariatric surgery here at the Kalili Center. And one of his issues was he comes from an Italian family, and when he gets the surgery, he's not necessarily going to be able to eat pasta. This was such a strong sense of anxiety for him, because pasta in his family, he associated with his mother made homemade pasta. She would take it personally, very similar to the experience I had. And he was concerned that his family would be very angry at him. And the truth is, his family was uncomfortable with his choices. But when we talked about it more, similar again to what I did, is it had to be a learning process. He had to take his family through that process and realize there was going to be a lot of resistance. Because what it would also do, it forces people to think about who they are. People will personalize their choices and the choices they make and how it makes them feel about themselves. So people that have anxiety about themselves will probably be the ones that have the most resistance to changing their food choices by wanting to stop or deter you from making choices for themselves. Another powerful image I wanted to think about was this concept of culture and our previous life experiences and how it may play into our food choices. I'm working with an elderly lady here in Los Angeles, and she's a survivor of the Holocaust, and she is overweight. When I work with her, she's got a great diet plan. She's diabetic. She's trying to curb her sugar intake or carbohydrates. The fear she has that gets triggered is when she starts to lose some weight. It puts her back into that place when she was starving in the concentration camps, and all that old trauma starts to come back to her and resurface, and though it's happening today. So the process of losing weight for her re-traumatizes her back into a state of being in the concentration camps, and very difficult for her to move to that place. Even though intellectually she knows this is something she has to do, the trauma causes so much anxiety, it stops her from being consistent in losing weight. So what we had to do in those moments when a lot of the trauma was coming up was, through an emotional process, I had to help her get to the other side of it and help her feel stronger emotionally as a person, so she could tolerate some of the anxiety and continue on with her pursuit of healthy living and healthy food intake. A lot of people have a very similar kind of issue, whether dealing with PTSD as a war vet. You see this a lot with vets. You see it a lot with survivors of abuse, of rape, abuse, etc. And how our culture deals with trauma a lot of times, and how we process through it and how we respect it, a lot of times will affect the ways we deal with food and the food choices that we make. So again, I wanted you to see the complexity of these choices and how much they influence us. Coping methods, okay? So I understand there's a complex issues around environment, culture, and family, and how it affects our food choices, but what can I do? And here's a few thoughts. There's a lot of things in our environment that we cannot control, especially, for instance, living here in Los Angeles. We know that there could be an earthquake at any moment, and literally the roof can come tumbling down. Other than preparing ourselves, there's not much we can do about that. So we have to accept that as a risk of living here. We can't control our environment that way. But we can control a lot of times what we put in our mouth. And that's something that I want you to think about, is what can I control and what can I not control? The more I can control the trigger of putting, let's say, unhealthy food into my system, the more successful I may be. Understand what those personal triggers are for you, what those personal food triggers are for you, and try to stay away from them. It's like going to the gym. You want to build up your strength. You're not going to start bench pressing at 200 pounds. You may start with the bar and then move up 10, 15 pounds, etc. So try to stay away those trigger foods, and know that there's certain things that you need to control in your environment and certain things that you can't, and try to be less sensitive to those things that you cannot control. There is a lot of pressure in families and in cultures to be a certain way, and a lot of cultures' food is so interconnected with how love is expressed, how freedom is expressed, how certain holidays are celebrated. You have to help people understand that making choices that may be different than theirs are not going against their belief systems and are not stopping them from making those choices for themselves. It's just a sense of wanting to do something that you need to do to take care of yourself. Get them to depersonalize it. One of the ways you can do that is, don't be afraid to over-explain yourself. Don't just assume that somebody knows what's going on. Repeat it several times over. It's okay if someone turns to you and says, okay, you said that 10 times, because it's like dyeing a piece of cloth. It takes people a while to get it. It takes a while to get that cloth a certain color. Choose positive people in your life whenever you can. Don't, especially in your environment, your family. We're not out there when we're in the pursuit of healthy living. That's why I like to call it, I don't like to call it dieting, because it has a negative connotation and it means you're restricting yourself. I like to give it a positive spin, something that's ever expanding, the sense of constantly allowing yourself to have healthy living and making choices that allow you to go that way. Don't underestimate the power of people, especially when you're in a stressful situation. So as much as you can, try to surround yourself with those positive people that are going to reinforce you, especially in the early stages of developing a positive lifestyle. If some people get offended by that, better you figure out a way to deal with them being offended than just giving in to their pressure, because sometimes people will unconsciously or even consciously sabotage you because your choices make them feel uncomfortable and they don't necessarily want to change. So they're going to try to sabotage you, or just hopefully they'll end the relationship. Try to stay away from impulsive behavior. So for instance, if we go back to the earlier statement about when someone said about putting the cookies in a bag, I said, let's go one step further, put them in the back of your refrigerator, put some healthy fruits and vegetables in front of it. What we're trying to do is create a thought before the initial impulsive act. That's being mindful, that's creating thought, but sometimes you're going to have to put yourself in a relaxed state before you can have that. Because remember, anxiety is going to create, stress is going to create a certain level of anxiety. What I tend to do for me is I have to remind myself to breathe, and I literally allow the breath. Someone just stated, I'm going to say, they will do carrots before cookies. That's great. I think the idea that, carrots have a lot of fiber, they're a little bit sweet, and they can allow you to have that sense of sweetness. If you do that over a period of time, one thing you're going to find is your taste buds are going to change, and your sense of what feels good in your system won't. And I'm going to advocate this. Do that for a while, whatever that is, and then have a bite of that cookie, and I bet you'll find that the taste doesn't agree with you as much as the carrots, that your taste buds, your palate will actually change. So be relaxed, going back to my thought. Allow yourself to be mindful. Stay away from impulsive acts by allowing yourself to be relaxed. And you want to also, going back with our thought about when we talked about the media, that the media creates strong images for us about what certain food means. Don't underestimate your unconscious association with food. So chocolate maybe equal, feeling sexy or giving yourself a break. If you go back to the thought about carrots, if you start to use that as a food that's clean food, as I said, athletes use, or a food that fuels you, you may find that after a while, you've got to change your palate. Sometimes that takes a few weeks. That may actually give you that feeling. And what you're doing during that process is you're consciously changing the association you have with certain foods. Use food more, and the last thought is to nurture a new sense of yourself with the food choices that you make. What I want you to do is think of, okay, the bad choices, we're going to use those, all the foods that we all know are not necessarily good for us, give us an old sense of self. The new foods give us a new sense of self, and make a list, create some associations with it. Healthy foods make us feel alive, give us more energy, help us think clearer, make us feel better about how we look, how we associate with others, gives us a lesser degree of shame, makes us feel alive. The other foods, negative foods, put it in this paragraph, foods high in fat, carbs, make us feel weighted down, give us a sense of cloudiness, give us a sense of shame, cause our bodies to feel heavy and uncomfortable. That's your old sense of self. Nurture this new sense of self and recognize that it's a process. For instance, I've been doing this meal plan, and what I'm trying to do is every week try to eliminate and add something that I had from before. So for instance, if I eliminate rice, a carb that I'm trying to minimize, I'm going to put something else in its place. And I'm going to use that as a way of training myself, because maybe I thought a lot of carbs was so important to me. And then I experiment, and I've started to notice that I have more energy when I actually eat less carbs. And that's changed my psyche than what I thought was I needed the carbs to have more energy. Yes, and there's a place for carbs. I'm not against carbs, but we have to really limit what we do, especially if we're not exercising a lot, and we don't always need as many carbs as we think we do. What I wanted, we're going to come to the edge. We're going to come to the end of this webinar. I wanted to do sort of a couple takeaways. That our relationship with food is complex. Our relationship with the environment, our families, and our culture is complex. We have to look at the dynamic. We have to understand that these external factors play a powerful role in the food choices that we make and not minimize them. The unconscious messages that we make, that we get, play an important part in the food choices we make. Our belief system, our cultural belief system, has an important influence on the choices that we make, and the media has an important choice that we make. The more conscious we can become things, the more mindful we can become, the less impulsive we'll be. And then build that, really try to personalize. Like maybe you're trying to build a different sense of yourself that feels much better about who you are, and feeling better about your physical body is part of that choice. Stay focused on that. Stay focused on the end goal, and that may help you a great deal in making those choices. I wanted to thank everyone for listening to our webinar, and I always say this in the end, we can only touch on a few examples in here. This is something that is a very complex and difficult thing to talk about for some people because there's so many things coming at them. So be mindful, understand those choices. If anyone has any questions after this webinar, feel free to send us those questions. You can always find me at the Kalili Center Facebook, and you can put questions there and I will respond to them. We have a webinar coming up in a couple of weeks, and our webinar is going to be on February 24th. It's at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. It's on eating and image disorders, body dysmorphia, bulimia, anorexia nervosa, how people, their feelings about their body, and how it affects the food choices that they make. I want to thank everyone again, and we really appreciate you coming to our webinar and hope that you've learned something new.